Welcome to Barnyard Language. We are Katie and Arlene, an Iowa sheep farmer and an Ontario dairy farmer, with 6 kids, 2 husbands, and a whole lot of chaos between us. So kick off your boots, reheat your coffee, and join us for some Barnyard Language, honest talk about running farms and raising families.
In case your kids haven't already learned all the swears from being in the barn, it might be a good idea to put on some headphones or turn down the volume. While many of our guests are professionals, they aren't your professionals. If you need personalized advice, consult your people. Welcome to another episode of Barnyard Language. Thank you for joining us again here on the podcast. And we'll start, as usual, with Katie telling us what's going on the farm in Iowa, or with her kids, or with herself, or whatever she wants to talk about this week.
Well, Arlene, as I was just saying, I got all my hair cut off yesterday. I mean, it wasn't that long, but I have really thick hair and a lot of cowlicks, so even a little bit long is too much. And I was saying that I've been going gray from sort of the bottom of my head up, and so with cutting it all off, it's pretty much all gray, which is nice. You know, it's cool. It's a privilege to live long enough to go gray. So,
That is
and I'm way too disorganized to start dyeing it, because I'll just end up with that 4 inches of roots at all times.
Yeah, I tried for a while and it just wouldn't work. I would think, okay, I'll go ahead and book my appointment now for however many weeks the hairdresser says, and then I would have to cancel for some reason, and then months would go by, and it was like, yeah, I don't think this is going to work out for me.
Yeah, I mean, it took me almost 6 months to even get back in for a haircut, so I don't really like my chances of getting back to keep up with dyeing. And I know folks say, well, it makes you look younger, but I'm like, at some point your face is 75. No amount of hair dye is going to fix that. So, I mean, if makeup and hair dye and all that is your jam, awesome, do it.
For sure.
But if it's not, that's fine too.
Yeah, it's your head.
It's your head. Exactly. You're the one who has to look at it. Other than that, I think we're all done with hay for the year. Thank God. We have not. A few of our neighbors have started harvest, but we haven't. Things aren't quite dry yet. And it's been gorgeous the last couple days, but the temperature just dropped like 20 degrees outside. So I was late because I was closing all the windows and firing the furnace up and finding a sweatshirt because it's cold in here.
It's officially fall time.
And we have a cow who's been in with the bull keeping him company because she was already bred, and she calved yesterday and apparently chased the bull out over/through a pipe gate because he was looking at her calf. So good mothering. Anyway, he's happier because now he's back out with the cows, which was going to happen like next week anyway. So
right, she just sped up the process.
Yeah. How are things at your place, Arlene?
It has been a busy week on the farm. Technically, I didn't have really anything to do with it. We decided several years ago that we were going to get rid of some of our older equipment and not replace it. So we don't actually do our own silage. We hire a custom operator to do corn silage, and we've never owned our own combine. So we also have a different custom operator come and do combining. So this week was the perfect weather week. It was dry. It was going to be sunny every day. There was a bit of frost every morning. And so the silage got done in 2 days, and the soybeans got done in 2 days, and all that's already locked and loaded. So the silos are full. We filled another bag with some extra silage that didn't fit in the silos, and the soybeans have all gone to the elevator, and someday we'll get paid for them. So that's pretty exciting to have them off the field and have the potential of a check coming to us instead of all the money going out. So yeah, a lot of bare fields now. So it looks a lot different around here.
Well, and it's always nice to have the potential of money coming in instead of the potential of, a storm taking your crop down or something.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking of our guest last week who had cotton in the field and waiting for a hurricane to hit. So it's definitely nice to have things get out of the fields and put away where they're supposed to be. And other than that, it feels like not much. The kids are going to school most days. We haven't really had too much sickness. I mean, I should probably knock on wood because I'm sure it's coming, and we're getting ready for Canadian Thanksgiving. So this episode will come out on Thanksgiving Monday. So we've got couple of family gatherings this weekend, and I'm not hosting any, so I just have to make some food to bring, but I don't actually have to clean my house, so that's a bonus.
And did you say it's your sister's birthday? Or it
It will
was?
be, yeah,
Oh,
it will be my sister's birthday on Monday.
did you want to wish her a happy birthday?
Happy birthday, Janine.
Yeah. Happy birthday, Janine. Anything else, Arlene? Oh, do you guys get a tremendous, horrifying influx of bugs when they take the soybeans out?
I haven't noticed it, so there
Oh,
mustn't be because there's a soybean field right beside our house.
we never got it when I lived in central Iowa, but up here we get those, the Asian ladybugs in
I guess
just
I have noticed a few
horrifying
ladybugs the last couple
swarms.
of days, but yeah,
Yeah.
not horrifying swarms.
Oh,
Just
no, like thousands, like
oh,
falling off the ceiling. Yeah.
ooh,
Bleh, bleh,
yikes!
yeah.
No, must just be an Iowa thing, or maybe just your neighborhood. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we have anything else?
I don't think so, and I know that this episode is going to be a longer one, but I'm really excited for you all to listen to it. So we will keep our talking short so that you can hear more from our guest. Here she is.
So
Today, we are speaking with Lorraine Van Ewyk, a registered social worker and counselor here in Ontario. She is a foster mother with expertise in children's mental health and is the co-founder of the National Farmer Mental Health Alliance. So, Lorraine, we start each of our interviews with the same question, and this is a way to introduce yourself to our listeners. And we ask, what are you growing? So, for our farmers, that can cover crops and livestock, and it can also cover families, businesses, and anything else you'd like to talk about. So, what are you growing?
I love that question because I love the intentionality behind it. We are growing a couple of things. So on our farm right now, we have turkeys, chickens, and sheep. So it's breeding season for us, meaning that hopefully in January and February, we will have lots of new little lambs on the ground. From a perspective as a mom and foster mom, I'm growing community members. I like to pour into my kids, and beyond that, obviously the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance is getting lots of time and attention because our community has been rocked with farmers who died by suicide. And it has really motivated us to do something in a very proactive movement to ensure that farmers get the help they need, the resources they need, and that we can support the ones who support farmers. So that's the other piece. And then lastly, we also have an on-farm bakery business. And so that has been lots of time and attention and 4 a.m. bread baking moments. So yeah, that's a little bit about my life in a nutshell.
Lauren, I loved what you said about raising community members, because that is such an important thing that we're focusing on in our family, as well as just, I mean, obviously we have hopes and dreams for who our kids will be, but mostly I want them to be decent humans and I want them to not be jackasses.
Right.
You know?
Life goals are good, but
Yeah, like,
I think sometimes as parents, we get wrapped up in the achievement piece. Oftentimes when I'm counseling somebody and just getting to know them, I will ask about, what do they like to do? Kind of who are they? And people will very quickly say the things that they're good at, which is wonderful. And they'll tell me about the things they're passionate about, which is wonderful. And then I ask them this question. I say, tell me about a character trait that you like about yourself. Oh, there's some silence that follows that inevitably, because we have a hard time recognizing those pieces of ourselves that's part of our character that grows our identity and who we are and what we offer our world and our community. And so I spend a lot of time kind of growing that piece with clients because it's just a really critical part of understanding who we are. Yeah.
it's interesting to me too that it seems like we don't talk about it because it's seen as bragging, where like talking about a sports achievement is not bragging, but saying that you're kind or tenacious or curious is. And that's very weird. Anyway.
I'm just going to loop back to the what you're growing questions, because we have farmer listeners. So usually we end up asking what breeds of animals we're talking about, just for the curious farmers. So what
I
kind
was
of
coming
sheep are
back
we?
to that, Arlene.
Okay, Katie wondered about the sheep too. She's also a sheep farmer.
I actually knew she was a sheep farmer because on one of your other podcasts, she said, you either have healthy sheep or dead sheep. You have to be really mindful of it. And I had this massive chuckle because We have a friend of ours, his name's George Dickinson, and he would say to me, he would say, now, Loren, you have to understand that when sheep get up in the morning, not that they actually get up in the morning, but when they get up in the morning, their goal is to die. And your job, when you wake up in the morning, is to make sure they don't die. And then he said, some days you win and some days you lose, because inevitably with our very best efforts, stuff happens. And so, I was just laughing because our lead had spoke so well about with sheep. It just seems like, yeah. But as far as our breeds, the majority of our breeds are Suffolk. We have some Oxford still in our lineage, but most of it is a Suffolk Dorset cross. And we do that because we also have a wool business. So we have partnered with a wool mill in Frankenmuth, Michigan, and we take our wool to Frankenmuth, Michigan to get cleaned, and then we make wool and wool roving out of it, and then sell that as well.
Very cool. And how
I
many
love
kids
how
do you
every
currently
time.
have in your house? Sorry, back to the human side.
Sorry.
So how many humans do I have in my house right now?
Yeah, how many humans in your house at the moment?
We're kind of a flexible human counting family.
Sure.
But right now, there's only 4 of us because we have 3 biological children and we have 2 chosen children. And so the 3 biological have kind of flown the coop. We have one who's attending the Carleton University in Ottawa. We have another one who's recently got married and has a little baby. So I'm an Oma. I'm a young Oma, so I'm coming into that title. And then our son and his wife live in Cambridge, which is about 2.5 hours away, so kind of close to Guelph, as you mentioned. And so there's only 4 of us right now, but
that number changes.
Yeah. That number changes. Yeah, that's right.
So, Loren, now that we're on that topic, how did you get started in doing foster care?
Fostering is it's a personal story for us. So my husband was actually adopted at the age of 6. Now, if anybody who has some familiarity with the system, they'll go, ooh, 6. Because that means he spent the first 5 years in his family of origin. And his family of origin consisted of a biological mom and many different men who were involved in that relationship. And subsequently, there was some very significant abuse. And so my husband was removed from that home and with his brother, and they were placed into foster care for a period of only about 6 to 8 months. I think they came into foster care in February, and by late August, they were adopted. So it was back in that would have been 1983 or so. No, I'm sorry, 1979. It was a pretty quick turnaround at that time. And so he was adopted into a Dutch immigrant family who weren't able to have their own biological children, and they ended up adopting 4 children. And so fostering was so close to our hearts because it made such an impact on my husband's life and his development and his need to have to deal with trauma, which is, of course, an ongoing life journey. It's not like you just deal with it and pack it away and everything's, Skittles and sunshine. So it was very personal. So we actually, when we were first married, I was a young bride. I got married at the age of 20. I had just turned 20. And so sometime around there, we actually started that process of becoming foster parents in Prince Edward Island, where he grew up and where we were living at the time. And then we were blessed with our own children. And so it kind of got put on the shelf for a little bit, but I always tell people it's okay to put some things on the shelf because it doesn't go rotten up there. It's not like fruit, that goes rotten. It's okay to put some of those goals on the shelf and we can take them back down. We have the time to really embrace them. And so that's what happened is in 2009, we took it back down off the shelf and we began our fostering journey with an organization called Nairn Family Homes, which operated out of Park Hill, Ontario at the time. So that's how it started.
Loren, that's really interesting to me because we did fertility treatments and then started the foster to adopt process here in the States, figuring that we weren't going to have biological children. And then, as is apparently really common,
very common,
started the classes and promptly had a baby and then promptly had a second baby. So what advice do you have for folks who are considering opening their home to foster children, whether they have biological children or not, especially because that's something that it sounds like you were on a very similar path to what we've done?
Yeah, and we have never formally adopted our children who have come to us through foster care. Many usually because the children who come to us have some really significant needs. So whether it's a global developmental delay, meaning that they fall below the sixth percentile, I believe it is, or whatever. And then we also have some who have come to us with some really significant health issues. So some have had terminal illnesses. Some have had kind of life debilitating illnesses where, their life progression just looks very different, but all have a unique journey and all have an incredibly valuable journey. And I think for me, that's one of the poignant parts of being a foster parent is understanding that this journey looks so different for so many people. And yet every one of them has this value. Every one of them has this story that goes with it that produces life, and when you share it with other people, it encourages people. So I want to say that first of all, fostering is not easy. I'm not sure if people, sometimes I come across people who have kind of this romantic idea that I'm going to open my home and these children are just going to love me so much because I've given them this home, and I'm kind of like big red blinking signs that say no, that's not what this looks like. You have to remember that children who have been, at least in Ontario, have been in the foster care system and then progress, typically they have had to function in a period of time in their life in this thing we call survival mode, right? Survival mode means I have to look out for me because nobody else is going to look out for me. So I have to look out for me. So there's this need. And then the other piece of it, we talk often about this thing called attachment. And I listen to a lot of Dr. Karen Purvis out of Texas State University. I believe it's Texas State University, but anyway, it's the child development group down there, Dr. Karen Purvis. And she talks so much about attachment and how critical it is in relationship, along with a number of other, Dr. Gordon Neufeld, there's all sorts of different people that talk about attachment. So if you're coming into this relationship with these Skittles and sunshine glasses on, I want you to know it's time to take those off and really understand what you're committing to, because it is incredibly rewarding. And it is costly. It costs a lot of yourself. Sometimes it costs your expectations, right? But it is incredibly rewarding. I still have kids who were part of our family for short periods of time, sometimes 6 weeks, call me now. And this is 12 years later. And they will say, you know what? I remember swimming in your pool and just really enjoying that period of time. And you have to remember that they're in this period of transition and stress and chronic stress. And so what we see in these kids a lot of times is this post-traumatic stress disorder, because they've been under chronic stress for this long period of time. And so we see hypervigilance in them, meaning they're always looking for danger. Their brain's always tricking them, saying there's a bear in the room and you're going to get eaten, so you better run. And so when you have that with kids, you really have to understand that our expectations have to be a little bit different. We parent children with trauma differently than we parented children that didn't experience trauma. That's just the reality of our world. The other piece that is really important, if you're thinking about getting into fostering, understand that you cannot do it alone. Like really, honestly and truly, our family, extended family, have played an impactful role in our children's lives. So my dad passed away this year, but my mom is still with us, and she still comes over regularly to help out. And our children are they feel very safe. They feel very attached now, because we've gone through a lot of these growing pains together. So a support system is really important. The other piece is you need to at some point sit down and say, what do we need in order to make this really work? I'm not sure. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what it's like in the States, but the compensation for foster parents in Ontario used to be somewhere around $30 a day. And I think I spent $30 a day on gifts from Dollarama or the dollar store, just trying to motivate these kids to, okay, it's time to clean your room. Right? Honestly, if you're looking for any kind of a financial gain, it's a misnomer. You will not find it in the foster care system. You do this because you are called to really pour in to young, vulnerable people in our society. And so sometimes you need to really step back and say, what do we need to do in order to really make this thrive? Does it mean that you're going to hire a cleaning lady, or a cleaning gentleman, or a cleaning company, once every 3 or 4 weeks? Then that's got to be kind of part of your plan.
It seems like, just like with raising any children, if you're actually coming out ahead financially, you're probably doing it wrong. Kids,
Right?
like, everybody told me how expensive kids were, and I was like, there's no way. Oh my God. So much money, just throwing it.
Oh,
Just
how-
just burn it. Just burn it and be done with it, Oh.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the things that's so important to remember is that kids don't end up in foster care because things are going well in their lives. It's never a good thing that puts them into foster care. And, maybe ending up in foster care is a good thing in the long run, but it's never a happy story that gets them to that point, and that's.
No, and the stories are complicated, right? Like, they're not these straight, easy, like, well, one day I woke up and boom. I'm like, no, like, they're convoluted stories. And, oftentimes we try kinship arrangements, and we dip into foster care, and then we're back with our biological families. And sometimes that rotation happens. We had one young gentleman who came to live with us for a while, and his family had 13 open and close, openings with the Children's Aid Society in the period of about 5 years. It was a very complicated situation, understanding that I'm not saying they were right or they were wrong. It was a complicated situation, but can you just imagine 13 times you've got a CAS agent having a file on you? So that means they're coming and visiting, and they're putting expectations, and it means mom or dad is doing something differently and trying to jump through hoops, hopefully. And, we're going to different appointments. Like, it's not this like kumbaya moment. There's a lot that goes into it. One thing I do want to say, Arlene and Katie, is that I often have people say, oh, God bless you for doing this. It's such like as if it's this really kind of admirable thing. And I get that. I appreciate that. But then they say this: I could never do it because I could never give them back. And can I just be honest to say that breaks my heart when I hear that? Because what I hear people actually saying is that love will cost me too much, so it's not worth loving at all. Maybe I'm being naive. I don't know. But I think, wow, really, for that child, that period of time of love, yes, it will cost you. I get that. But you make an impactful difference on this young person's life. So it will cost you, but the payoff for that child is immeasurable. And then I would say, is it worth it? And I would say, yes. Oh, hands down, it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
We got a call last week about this young child who needed a home. Now, we couldn't meet her needs. So we said, no, I'm sorry. We just cannot meet. They were very significant medical needs, like 24-hour nursing medical needs kind of thing, that type of a need. So even though we couldn't meet it, I think it will cost you, but that cost is worth it. It absolutely is worth it.
And I mean,
So,
really, if we
Lauren,
look at, I was just going to say, if we look at all of our relationships, I mean, there's potential cost in every relationship we have, right? I mean, our kids are going to grow up, people in our lives are going to die, like you can't get away from not loving people and not investing in relationships, because there's going to be loss, because this is just the cost of living, right? And that really, it almost, I mean, not that everyone has to do it, but it comes across as a kind of an excuse, right? Like, I couldn't do it. I mean, it's okay to say I couldn't do it because it would be too hard, but the letting them go piece, I think, is part of what we all live with in all aspects of life.
And it is hard.
Oh,
it
for
is
sure.
hard to say, they're going back to biology. But you know what? That part of that story might have been a changing point for that parent, and those relationships are healed. And so it is hard, but you're right. Every relationship costs us. And so love does cost. I've heard people say before, love is a verb, it's an action word, and boy, is it ever, right? Like, if we think about our relationships in life, it does cost us. just as you said, absolutely.
So, Loren, how old were your biological children when you started fostering?
Well, our youngest would have been 7, and our oldest would have been 11. Yeah, it would have been 11 at that time. And a lot of people say that you shouldn't start fostering, like you should always just foster children younger than your youngest. And we didn't adhere to that. We part of our organization, they're very focused on attachment, and we call it matching. So if a child, file comes across the desk and they read the different needs and, what's recorded. So depending on what that child is experiencing from a behavioral perspective or from an academic perspective, they will fit the child to the family to the best of the ability. So for instance, I homeschooled our children for a period of time, even though my husband is a public educator, but we homeschooled our children for a period of time. So when a child who presented with the need that they needed some specialized academic attention, it was a really good match for us, right? Because we were already really engaged. So some of those children were older than our oldest, some of them were in between, and some of them were younger than our youngest. And so we based it more on this matching perspective rather than ticking of a box. So we were fortunate that way. It doesn't always happen that way, which is one of the reasons why we were really glad that we went with a different organization, a more private kind of organization.
How did your biological children feel about having to share you with these new kids? Or what was that process like to explain to them where these other kids were coming from and what that looks like for them?
I think we were a little bit naive, which in this case was maybe good, because what ended up happening was our biological children kind of banded together. It was like, okay, they kind of teamed up with the child or children, in the end. It wasn't difficult for my children to share me, but remember, we had a very different life experience because I was homeschooling them. So I was home. And so I don't think it was as difficult to share my attention. And also remember, because we're going through a matching process, a lot of those kids kind of fit in with the family in a way that it didn't feel. Now, I won't say that happened every time. I remember one young fellow we had, and I would pay my children, $5 for 15 minutes for them to go out and entertain this child who had more energy than you could imagine. I mean, if you think about a stallion horse that just is going and going and going, I'm saying stallion horse and not Tasmanian devil for a reason, right? Like, this child just required so much energy. And I think by 12 o'clock, I was so wore out. I was like, who wants $5? And, just go outside and like throw a football or run or, because he just required so much energy. And that is due to trauma. Like that's part of that traumatic experience, that he just needed that constant stimulus. And I think looking back, I know a lot more now than I did then. But if you asked any of my children, and a lot of my children are really good and articulate children, so they speak about foster care from their perspective of being a sibling foster, provider, they will say it was one of the best experiences of their life because it shaped them. All of my kids have this unwavering compassion for people. And it actually, I'm one of those parents, I stand back, I'm like, wow, how did that happen? Right? Like, I don't know how that happened, but I have a son who works with special needs adults, and he called us the other night because it was one of those situations where you were loving on somebody and it was a messy situation kind of thing, right? Like, and I have another son who just can connect. He actually was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2.5, which boggles my mind because he can connect with anybody, right? He can connect with young kids and he can connect with older adults because he's just able to do that. And my biological daughter is able to connect with hurting. Like, she can perceive when something's not right based on, I think, because we were a foster family, she learned some of those signs that things were kind of off. And so she'll tell the story of in high school, she was walking by a girl and she just really felt like, oh, there's something going on. And so she sat down with this girl, and this girl was in a mental health crisis and contemplating suicide. And so she was able to kind of say, you know what, we need to tell somebody, let's go and talk to this safe person. So it was a teacher that, my daughter knew would be a safe person kind of thing. So she went and got the help that was needed. So all of my kids would say, even though it was hard, because they sacrificed a lot, like sometimes they were sharing toys and they were sharing family experiences. So one of our foster children had almost the same birthday as our son. And so of course we had some shared birthdays. I mean, there was times where we didn't do that, but there was times where we did share based on how busy we were at that season of our life. So there was a high cost to them as well, but hands down, every one of them, in fact, each of them have talked about becoming foster or adoptive parents at some point in their life.
Wow, that's a clear sign that, that obviously it was more positive than
rewarding. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel living on a farm or in the country, raising animals, those types of things? How did that both help your experience, both as a parent and a foster parent, and what parts of that made it more challenging?
Well, I think the more challenging part is safety limitations, because when you're on a farm, we've got large equipment, we've got access to a great big pond, and we have animals who don't always like attention. And so part of what we do now is we do respite, meaning some foster kids will come on the weekend. So they don't always know, or weekends or weeks, or a couple weeks at a time, they don't always know the limitations. And so it requires a lot of supervision. It requires a lot of safety kind of things in place. Like we do lock gates and we do lock barn doors and things like that partly for that reason. But on the flip side of it, what has it offered? Part of what we teach at the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance, and I know we're going to get into that, we teach about animal assisted therapy. And I can't tell you the level of effectiveness it is for kids who've experienced trauma to be able to nurture an animal. In fact, because what we know is that some of the kids that we have the privilege of raising or being a family for them when they need one, is they haven't received the nurture that they needed. And so they have a hard time receiving nurture from an adult. They just don't trust adults to provide what they need. They've had to kind of fill their own needs. But when you team up that child with an animal, like a little young lamb that needs to be bottle fed, and that child nurtures and pours into, and feeds an animal, even though they didn't get fed, and cares for, sometimes we have lambs, and Arlene, you'll know this, they get born with their hooves kind of turned under. And so we have to put a stilt on their hooves and we wrap it to make sure that they develop the muscle structure so they have, solid foundation to build upon. And so our foster kids have helped, can you hold the lamb while I, nurture where I care for it. So it's been incredibly impactful. In fact, in my own private practice, there are times where if I'm working with a child who's experienced a lot of trauma, it's very threatening for them, no matter how low I kind of put my chair and make sure that the power differential is minimized. So I'm not using language that is, adult language, and I'm trying to be as warm and welcoming as I can be. They're scared because anytime that they've had any interaction with adults, it has resulted in scary situations. But I can take that child out to, it's called a creep pen, which is where only lambs can go, because there's certain gates that, prevent big ewes from going in. So only lambs can go. There's a heat lamp in there, so it's warm, and there's always fresh straw and fresh hay and, kibble that's really high in protein, so really healthy for the lambs. It's a growing environment is what it is. And there have been times where myself and my client have gone in, sat down with the lambs and allowed those lambs to kind of crawl over my client. And suddenly, as they're caring for and, petting these lambs, they can talk about some really hard things in their lives. So it has been invaluable experience. I think I can't help but say what we offer from a rural perspective for kids from hard places is really a healing. It's part of their healing journey. And I'm thankful for that. Really very thankful for that. Yeah.
So we did say we're going to get to the National Farmer Mental Health Alliance. So let's go there now. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it was founded and what the Alliance does? What's your mission and what are you working on?
Sure. So the National Farmers Mental Health Alliance, we are actually a pretty young organization. It formed earlier this year when a couple of like-minded therapists said, we've got something unique to offer. So in my private practice, I've been working with farmers for, I don't know, at least 10 years. And that's been my adoption, and farmers are really nearly 100% of my clientele. And so I've been working with farmers for a number of years. And one of the consistent themes is that when they've tried to access service, number one, as farmers, we're very reluctant to access services at all, because due to stigma, due to numerous barriers. There's so many barriers for farmers to access services, which are slowly being broken down, which I'm thrilled for. But, I'd have a farmer who would come to me and say things like, I lost my 5th generation farm. And when I told my therapist, she said, well, it's not that big a deal. Just save up some money and buy a new farm. Right? Like, what? That's crazy. They clearly don't understand what it means to lose a legacy. And the farmer would say, the thing that bothers me the most is I don't have a farm to pass on to my children. Like they could handle their own sense of failure for losing the farm, but to not have something to pass on to the next generation, because that's that legacy piece. It's part of our identity as farmers. I had another young woman who came and she said, well, I went and spoke to, it was like a guidance counselor of sorts. I'll kind of leave it at that. And the guidance counselor couldn't understand why this young woman was so upset. But what the situation was is she and her dad had, they had done 4-H through all the years. They had been selective in their breeding and their stock that they brought in with the sole goal of her taking over this farm. And then she got to her grade 12 year and said, I really want to become a veterinarian. Now, the guidance counselor was like, that's fantastic. You're not going to be a farmer. You're going to be a veterinarian, And so the counselor was dismissive and was like, your dad will be fine with it. He'll understand. Well, you and I know that that's not the case. I mean, this is years of breeding in mind and succession planning. We've had these 18 years of succession planning in place, and suddenly that's changing. And so part of what we do at the National Farmers Mental Health is we want to help clinicians, help therapists understand the issues that farmers face, the barriers that we face when we're accessing help, and really make sure that therapists have an understanding of how to build an effective therapeutic relationship with farmers, because we're a different breed. Like, we're fixers by nature. If we see a problem, we want the answer, we want to fix it right away, right? And we don't like to ask for help when it comes to mental health, but we'll ask for help if our sprayer's broken or our combine's broken, right? I'll call Johnny next door and he can help me out. But if I'm experiencing a mental health issue, I don't tell anybody. I definitely don't tell my doctor, and I definitely don't tell my spouse. I will kind of hint to my feed guy or my fertilizer guy or my seed gal or my veterinarian, but I rarely reach out to my spouse, like to really say I need support, or to my doctor. That doesn't happen. Everything's peaches and cream when it comes to them. So we formed earlier this year, kind of officially, even though we've all been working in the industry for a number of years. And so that's one piece of it, is training therapists. The other piece is to really respond to the need as farmers call us. And one of the big things that we're doing is we're partnering with other organizations. So like Milk Movement and the Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario, to provide webinars and literacy pieces so they can reach farmers directly through their kind of avenue. And they've got good researched information and skills to do so. I think sometimes we've got all sorts of people who have great ideas because that was impactful in their life. That doesn't mean that it's really helpful in everybody's life. And so we really want to make sure that people are getting good information and good strategies and that sort of thing.
I think too, one of the things that folks miss when you're talking about, farmers or anybody in rural areas is just the lack of privacy and the absolute lack of resources. Our nearest therapist is 25 miles away, and it's still a small town. And, I personally don't really care, but I know a lot of folks who would not want to be seen coming and going from the therapist office. And, if you go to a small town pharmacy, that pharmacist, and they know what meds you're on, and they probably have a pretty good idea why you're on those meds. And it's, maybe you don't want everybody to know everything about you.
Well, and I mean, there's benefits to having a small community. But you're
Yeah.
right. It's also, everybody knows everybody else's business. Interesting enough, in the US, 70% of US counties don't have a single child or adolescent psychiatrist. In Canada, in urban populations, okay, there's one psychologist for every roughly 3,000 people. But in urban populations, it's one for every 9,000 plus people. So it's a huge fold difference between accessibility. And so it is a major barrier for sure.
So
What kind of
one of the
responses have you gotten from therapists themselves when you talk about the issues that farmers face? I mean, it seems obvious to us, but I guess what's
Yeah.
obvious to us is clearly, not that way for other people. So I'm just curious about what kind of reactions you've gotten from clinicians.
Lots of, oh, wow, this is so helpful. Lots and lots, because therapists want to do well. Like, I don't know a therapist who wants to screw up somebody else's life.
Yeah. Otherwise, they're in the wrong profession.
But we sometimes, out of our desire to do well, we don't recognize what the expertise that's brought to the table. And so one of the things I encourage therapists to do is recognize the expertise before you. Sometimes therapists think, oh, well, farmers are uneducated. A lot of times therapists think, oh, it's all Skittles and sunshine for them because they just work twice a year where they plant and they harvest and that's it. And so, like, it's not intentional. It's just a lack of understanding. And so when you bring that understanding, like, for instance, I was telling somebody this morning, well, even our pork prices are can be controlled by the Chicago market. And so they're like, wow, really? Like, people don't have a good understanding of all of these issues, like weather. It might be a beautiful sunny summer for some people, but it's been a completely dry drought season for farmers, and our beans are this high, right? And so generally the response is a great deal of respect for farmers, which we need. It's one of the pieces that farmers are really feeling an impact from, is that there's a disjointedness between the consumer and the producer. And so we need to help join that up. And that's one of the things that we do.
I feel like one of the things that gets missed a lot too is that, other jobs, you don't like your coworkers, you get a different job, or you don't like your in-laws, you don't live next door to them. You don't like your house, you just move to a different house. And a lot of these things are not possible for farmers, or, that coworker we don't like is a sibling or an in-law, or some days our spouse. And, that we can't just leave. Or like, for us, my husband's the 4th generation in this house. We're not going to just move to town because I don't like living in the country, which I do love living in the country. But for example, and just when I moved onto this farm, I had no idea how much, honestly, grieving there would be about the fact that we're never going to buy a house together. I mean, we're never going to pick out a house. We're never going to go house shopping. This is it. And then someday we'll move to the other house on the farm, and hopefully one of our kids will take over this house, and that's it. And so it doesn't even have to be big dramatic stuff that you're dealing with, but there's just a lot that folks don't understand if they haven't been there or we haven't told them about it, because I'm assuming that in counseling school or psychiatry school or whatever, there's not like a class about how to deal with farmers, and it's not fair to expect people to understand something that we haven't educated them about.
So there isn't a class yet. That's part of what
There
we're doing.
should be. Absolutely.
There needs to be. There absolutely needs to be. And I think I hope that's going to change. I really do hope that's going to change. I mean, part of what we've developed is this thing called agriculturally informed therapy, which is 12 plus hours. So it's basically, there is a course wrapped up in it, and we are working slowly on a book manual that goes with it. So I agree with you, because I love what you said there. You don't realize the grieving process. I've worked with the majority of my clients in this case are women who have married farmers and move on to the farm. And they come into this marriage relationship with a set of expectations on them they had no idea existed. right? They really had no idea. Oh, wait, now my job is to make field meals and drive out field meals.
Yeah, and just how much that changes, and honestly, how much there should be relationship counseling for farm families too. Because I mean, if I Google marriage counseling or whatever, and it's like, go on a date night every week. Like, well, cool. There's no babysitters. And if there are, I'm dropping an extra $70 to pay the babysitter. And, we haven't been on a date night in 6 months at best, and I work with my husband and I work with my extended family and his family and our children, and our work is literally in our front yard and often literally in our house. During lambing, there's usually lambs in my bathtub or in the kitchen, and there's no distance, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But it would be a lot more helpful to me to deal with professionals who understood that this is normal in our lives, even if it isn't normal for most people.
Yeah. Yeah. The advice to leave work at work when you can walk out your door and see a cow that's gotten through a fence, or when you see the things outside your window that need to get done is a little bit harder to do than even if you're working from home and can at least shut the laptop or walk away from the office.
But there's no leaving it at work. It was,
No.
or just dealing with the text messages that get sent when those fucking cows are out again, and dealing with the anger and frustration without it becoming a permanent part of your family.
Mhm.
It's always interesting to me though, because that is one of the juxtapositions or the dichotomy of farming, where we work in this world of isolation because we're quite isolated. We don't have different, you talked about, working with your family. I mean, how many times did I go into work and I'm surrounded by 40 different people? I can kind of choose who I have lunch with, right? I can build relationships with people that, okay, we have a bit of a shared, but it's different in farming. And so we're isolated in one sense, and yet we're overly connected in another sense, right? And the other sense is we're constantly on call 24/7. And it always, I had one client who came and the therapist had said to them, look, you have a choice. You either go on vacation or you sell the farm. That's your choice. What? Like that's just crazy. A lot of farmers can't, like they literally feel like they can't go on vacation, or sometimes they don't want to go on vacation as well. It looks different. Self-care just looks different for farmers. But we have this dichotomy of isolation, and we're in small communities where everybody knows our stuff, and we're in families where everybody knows our stuff. And there's these different expectations, and we have these generational pieces, which always boggles my mind when I work with a lot of farmers that have experienced. So trauma actually changes our DNA for 4 to 5 generations, but 72% of adults have experienced trauma. So we've all impacted by it. But after World War II, we had a huge influx of farmers into our nations that fled Europe, but they lived in survival mode for 4 to 5 years. And yet we expect that relationships are going to flow just kumbaya, and they don't. And so now we have succession planning where you have somebody who is, I mean, some farms, by the time you're getting to the succession plan, they're huge corporations built from a life that was born out of survival mechanisms, right? And we're expecting them to hand over the reins and sing until the day is done. And that's just not possible. So we do have this huge dichotomy in farming between the isolation, and yet the interconnectedness is like so prevalent. So
the one that gets me is how often I hear, well, we never went to therapy. We dealt with X, Y, and Z, and we never went to therapy. And I'm like, well, maybe if you had, we wouldn't be spending 30 years in therapy. Like, at this point, I'm doing therapy so that my kids don't have to, or they can at least go to therapy for their own shit, not for the shit that's now 4 generations old that they're still dealing with the repercussions of. Like, where people talk about, well, my dad came back from the war and he was fine. And, yeah, he drank until he blacked out every night and he hit us, but that was fine. That's just the way it was. I'm like, that's not actually okay. That's not
No.
this is not acceptable.
Yeah. And that's another thing too, within agriculture, there's this socially acceptable, drinking and alcohol use that goes on, but it has become a real unhelpful coping strategy that we don't want to talk about. And so, we really, within our agriculture community, we have to kind of start taking off some of those blinders and saying, okay, wait a minute, what's going on underneath this surface where everything looks fine? Because as I mentioned before, and if you ever talk with Diane Bergsma, she shares her story beautifully. But she'll talk about her son who died by suicide. And on the outside, it looks so peachy keen. She said, now I can look back and I see these different dots that are connected. But at the time, and what I see all the time in farmers is they're under this chronic stress where they're functioning. They look like they're doing really well, but then they get to this point and it's a quick flip and there's hopelessness and helplessness and like, I just can't do it. And an interesting statistic recently is 25% of farmers have thought of taking their own life or have felt really like it's not worth it giving up. So it's a form of suicidal ideation. I mean, there's different degrees of suicidal ideation. In the past year, 25%, that's 1 in 4 farmers. And 68% of farmers, this is from 2016, a study that was done in Canada, and 68% of farmers are under this chronic stress. They feel it's chronic stress. And I'm like, that's telling. If we don't change something, what is that number going to be like in 10 years? Because that chronic stress continues to build, and that leads to hopelessness and helplessness and all of those pieces. So the statistics are glaring and equally so. And there's not like this border between our two countries that says, oh, everything's great over here. And like, no, like we are all in this stuff together.
Don't ruin that for us, because Americans, I think a lot of us have the secret hope that if shit gets bad enough, we can move to Canada. So just don't ruin it for me.
I have family members in the States that were like, so like, do you have an extra room? Like we could, if we claim asylum, can we just, right? Well, you'll have to be put to work on the farm.
We're already doing that here. Hell, All right. So one of the reasons we were excited to have you on the show is to talk about mental health in kids. So how do you know that your kid needs mental health support, and what are some resources for finding that?
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple of things. Sometimes we say, what's wrong with you to a kid? Like, well, there's nothing wrong with the child, but there's a lot of stuff going on. Let's get to the why behind it. Yeah. So what you said is bang on, is that sometimes we get lost in that performance piece and like, well, you should be able to do this. We put that expectation on kids, which actually increases worry. I talk all the time about helpful guilt, unhelpful guilt, and shame. I'm probably talking too much today, but I'm loving this conversation. So
no, do it.
You can cut and paste later, but
we can turn it into 2 episodes if we have to.
Okay, good. Part 1, part 2.
Turn it off and come back later if it's too long, whatever.
We talk about shame, which is that inherently sense of I'm deeply flawed. No matter what I do, I'll never measure up. That is often, kids feel that as early as 15 months of age, right? That is often birth in very young experiences of being deeply flawed. It's a huge emotion. Like, yes, sometimes we steal from somebody and we feel shame. That's different. That's an emotion of shame. I'm talking about this innate feeling of being deeply flawed. And then we talk about unhelpful guilt. Well, unhelpful guilt looks like kids, I don't know if you've ever run across them. I run across them all the time. A, typically they have anxiety. B, they care deeply about what other people think of them. They kind of fall into that people pleasing. We've got that sense of unhelpful guilt. Well, oftentimes kids feel this set of unrealistic expectations that we as adults place on them. And we are good parents. I'm not saying that we're not good parents, but we sometimes put expectations on our kids. We don't realize it at the time, but they're unrealistic. I tell the story often. My daughter, she'd go to school, and this one teacher who my daughter just loved, and this teacher like really loved her. She was like, my daughter was one of those, 99% kids. Things just clicked in her brain really naturally. I don't know that she got that from me. I don't know where it came from. My husband's pretty brilliant. But anyway, so the teacher would say things to her like, oh, Emily, don't worry about this test. You'll get 100% on it. And then my daughter would get back a mark of 97%, which you and I would go, holy, woohoo! right? That's not what my daughter did. She said instead, oh, I failed. I didn't reach my teacher's expectation of getting 100%. And so she'd go to her teacher and be like, oh, I only got 97. I'm sorry. I really studied. And the teacher trying to, and this is a good teacher, she's a fabulous teacher, but she would trying to console my daughter would say, well, don't worry about it. Next time you'll get 100%. Oh, she actually re-inferred and reset that expectation of being perfect, right? And so before you know it, from that births anxiety, because if we have worry that we're not going to get 100%, it motivates us to do really well. We study, we do well, we get rewarded. And before you know it, we've grown that worry bully, is how I call it with kids, right? It's a bit of a worry bully. And so that's that unhelpful guilt piece. And then helpful guilt is, of course, I did something wrong, I screwed up, I want to take responsibility for it. Unhelpful guilt is what I see all the time in kids, all the time. It's those kids who say, oh, I'm so sorry I didn't, bring you a glass of water. Like, well, nobody asked you to get a glass of water. You don't innately have to get me a glass of water or whatever. Like, they're apologizing for forgetting somebody's name. They're apologizing for, something not being quite 100%, whatever it is. Well, that's actually one of those signs that makes me go, ooh, ooh, ooh. Tell me about anxiety. Tell me about, is it something that kind of goes through your family? And inevitably, usually a parent will say, oh, well, I have dealt with worry, with anxiety. And so we see it kind of that pattern sometimes.
Mm-hmm. So already talked a little bit about, a lack of mental health care for children. But if we're talking, and I mean, obviously the barriers for rural kids exist in the same way they do for us as rural adults. But what options are out there, and what works best for, especially say like the under 10s? I mean, does talk therapy work, or what types of resources are best for our younger kids?
I want you to know that rural kids, I don't know if I said this earlier, but they're 4 to 6 times more likely to die by suicide than urban kids. And so that is one of those telling statistics that we've actually kind of missed the mark in our rural areas due to various barriers, due to various lack of supports. And so it's really important that we are providing within our school systems and within our communities. I don't know if somebody belongs to a faith community or they belong to a 4-H community. We need to be providing them with the education and the skills to teach kids, because they're not getting it through some of the other urban formats that they would receive it, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so what works best? Younger kids. One of the things I want to say, that what works good for one child might not work at all for another child. So it's really important that you figure out what works well for your child, and what works well for you is also really important. Some of the things that I work with my rural population, which is, like I said, nearly 100% of my kids. For young kids, I do a lot of puppetry, sand tray therapy. So anything where it's kinesthetic, where we're working through things. I have like a Playmobil, which is a farm setup. And so sometimes when kids, especially, younger kids, we're talking about, 7 and younger, or 8 and 9, those kids, they can play with that farm and they can talk about things that are bothering them. They can talk about, I used to be called sheep shit when I was in elementary school and in high school. And I think I probably went to school with a bit of stuff on my boots at some point. I don't, it's entirely possible. I know I did for work one day because I could smell it myself, but our rural kids, sometimes that teasing, sometimes those pieces, we feel almost guilty for being farmers, right? We feel like, oh, there's a problem because we are farmers. And so I have a lot of rural toys that kids can play with, and we can talk while they're playing. So which is really effective for kids. They learn through play. And so if they're learning through play, it's important that they learn mental health through play as well. Now, in light of that, sometimes we do things called behavioral redos, where, you're in this situation and this child said this to you and it was really hurtful. Let's figure out a different way to handle this situation rather than punching child X in the nose. What else could we do, right? And so we do behavioral redos. That works fantastic too for parents to learn. Instead of being like, blah, 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 blah. Okay, wait a minute. Whoa, I think I'm hearing some tone there. How about we try that again? And we just teach. The interesting thing is there's this thing called neuroplasticity. We'll probably talk about it a little bit later. It just means our brain can learn and change. It's not locked into place by the time we're 5 years old. That's a misnomer, right? So our kids can still learn and change. And yes, so can we. So as parents, we can learn to do things differently to encourage our kids to do things differently. So for our younger kids, I'm a big play therapy fan, because talk therapy can sometimes be really inundating. I don't know if you've ever been to church, anybody who's listening, but if you expect a 5-year-old to sit through that 20-minute sermon with their back up straight and their hands folded, you must drug them. I don't know how you do it. I've never been one of those parents that could ever do, you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. Kids need interaction. And so if you really want to get something, let's make it interactive. For our older kids, we still do play, but sometimes we play games, like, and especially to help with communication, right? So I play some different games, and before they take a turn, we identify a feeling that we had yesterday at school, and what did we do with that, and how did we, we flush that out. Okay, now it's your turn to hit the ice out of the brick or whatever. And so we still engage, but we kind of mesh the two between play therapy and talk therapy. One of the key ingredients, I've got to be honest with you, and I think I touch on this with every one of my clients, is that they are inherently valued. I work with a lot of, and we're going to get to teens here, and I can't help but talk about this because it happens all the time. I will have a teen who comes into my office who is super uber smart, who is the captain of every rugby and soccer group team that there is, who is a volunteer in their community, and everybody regards them as basically having all their stuff together, right? And they will sit and cry in my therapy room, say, I'm so sad. And I will say to them, do you know that you have value besides all these wonderful things? I mean, if you couldn't do anything, you still have value. There's a purpose for your life. You're not actually an accident in anybody's gamut of reality. There's purpose and you have value. And folks, we've kind of lost that somewhere along the way. Kids have not come to that understanding any longer, that they have value, that they're a valuable part of our community, and that they have intrinsic purpose. And so that's one of the focuses of therapy, is to come to that understanding. Because if you have value and you have purpose, then there's reasons for you to look at things differently. There's reasons for you to change. There's reasons for you to love yourself, knowing that you are lovable, knowing that you are loved. And so that is one of the pieces of therapy, particularly when working with teens.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Can you talk a bit more about teens and how we can support them in their journeys?
I love how you said journeys, because life's a journey, and it's not always an easy journey. In fact, I think sometimes it gets a little bit harder with every turn of the sun. I don't know what that is. I don't know what causes that. But in Canada, we have something called the Kids Help Phone. And the numbers of people accessing the Kids Help Phone has consistently increased over the years. I also want you to know that so long as we have relationship, we have influence. So when you think about those teens and you think, oh, they're teenagers, we're not supposed to get along, I want you to know that's a lie. That is not truth at all. So long as you have relationship, I'm not saying it's a perfect relationship. I'm not saying it doesn't come with a whole lot of bumps in that road. If it's anything like the rural roads of Canada, like, good golly, Miss Molly, there's a whole lot of rural bumps in those roads. But so long as you have a relationship, you have influence. In fact, as a parent, you have an incredible level of influence. So use that relationship, build that relationship, focus on that relationship. I have teens who come in all the time, and parents are like, oh my goodness, they're just blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, okay, well, tell me about your relationship. Well, it's non-existent. Well, then parents, you have some work to do. Because if you think that coming to therapy is going to fix your teen without you fixing relationship, we're living in a different world. That's not the reality that we live in. It's really critical that we focus on relationship. But for kids, we've got, we talk about telehealth. So I'm not sure, I know that in the US, in our rural areas, there's a severe lack of services. And I'm not trying to overemphasize, I'm not trying to minimize, I'm just saying there is a severe lack in services. So we need to put some people in charges of some things to get more services out there. Now, telehealth is a fantastic thing that happens in Ontario because we have so few child and youth psychiatrists. We have this thing called telehealth where your family doctor can line it up. And basically you spend 2 hours on for lack of a better word, a Zoom call. It's not actually through Zoom. It's, through the medical licensed kind of organization. And that psychiatrist in that 2 hours, after submitting documentation, sometimes from parents and from teachers or from other life impactful people, grandparents or guardians, that type of thing, you may receive a diagnosis and you may receive a recommendation for medication, for instance, back to your family doctor. So I think that's really good. I think it's really critical. I think it fills a gap. However, it's not completely filled because it's not an ongoing relationship. And sometimes our kids from hard places or our kids with some really severe needs, they need a longer term relationship. In fact, in Ontario, we have 25,000, actually 28,000 children waiting for mental health services in the province of Ontario alone, 28,000 kids waiting for services. I work with a number of families through foster and adoption who have children with reactive attachment disorder, and they have some really complex mental health needs. I've got young children trying to commit suicide. Young, when I'm talking young, I'm talking like, wow, how do they even know that, And so our residential services, there's a tremendous gap between needs that some families are presenting. Remember, a lot of families will try their best and they will exacerbate all of their own resources before they start reaching for outside help. So number one, families reach out for help sooner. Start this train sooner. If you don't need those services later on, that's okay. You can say, you know what, things are going swell. We don't need those services any longer. So start that train chugging sooner. Reach out for help sooner. In Ontario, we have these lead mental health, and those often have what we call walk-in clinics, meaning you don't have to make an appointment. You literally can walk in and say, hey, I think my child is struggling with worry. They're 7 or 8 years old or 9 years old. And, I've noticed, okay, well, let's tackle that. Let's have that conversation. Let's learn some strategies earlier. And so that is one of the great things, but we do have a huge wait for residential services. Does pouring more money into the system help? Maybe, probably. Will it fix it? No. We've really got to spend some time strengthening our communities. And I say communities because, as I said, children do not grow up in a vacuum. We have families and we have extended families and we have communities. And we've got to find ways to start these conversations earlier, to communicate to our kids that they are precious, that they are beautiful, they're wonderful, and that they have value. And we've got to equip people to deal with these life-altering situations and build resilience mechanisms in. An interesting report said that farmers' resilience levels are actually lower than the general population. I have a hard time believing that, to be honest. I want to believe it. I'm not trying to criticize the researchers. Farmers are fixers by nature. We're inherently resilient because we face things like drought and flooding and virus in our barns. I know, Katie, you talked about your sheep and cattle farmer. I remember one year we lost 75% of our lamb production to a virus that went through our barn. We had no control over, and I have never cried so many mornings in my life as I went out there and I held those lambs as they were dying, completely helpless to change the outcome.
We had a year like that once too.
Did you?
Yeah, it was
near breaks you.
8 years ago now, and it's still, yeah, you can feel it right there. But I wonder if the lack of resilience isn't just one more fucking thing, because
yes,
just one more fucking thing.
Well,
and whatever that thing is might be fine if that was the
Yeah.
only thing, but you've still got all these other things, and then there's one more fucking thing.
One more. And sometimes it is just that one more thing. The other thing is we have a hard time transferring our skills and resilience in farming to resilience in our emotional and relationship pieces, right? So it is just one more thing, and I can't do it anymore, and I give up, and I get that. The other piece is you have so many strengths in so many areas, but we've got to transfer them. And that transfer looks complicated to some people. So they don't bother trying there. They don't bother doing it because they don't know how to do it. So that's the other piece.
I will say, for some perspective in the States, we're seeing a lot of therapy via telehealth. Like, I see my therapist through telehealth. She's 20 miles away, but it cuts an hour out of my visit to not have to drive there. I've been seeing her for 2.5 years now, fairly regularly. And it's been great. And like, I was able to talk to a child psychiatrist the other day through a benefit that my company offers. She's almost 3 hours away, but
Mhm.
my company will pay for 8 visits with her, which is
Mhm.
incredible. And is
Amazing.
3 hours away was the closest one. So there's, thankfully my kids are not at a point where I would ever drive there to see her, at least, right now. But it's incredible to have that resource just in my computer. And,
That is
it's,
one thing that the pandemic has brought about good change.
yeah.
Really, honestly and truly, we are used to conversing over a computer now. And that has been incredible. So it used to be, we had kids who had anxiety that couldn't get out of their home. Like the anxiety was too high to even get out of their home to come for therapy. Well, therapists don't generally go to the home. And so what has happened is this has opened up an opportunity to begin to work on some of those anxiety things, or those other, we're really depressed, those things, without having to leave our home. And we see growth, we see change, we see positive things come out of it. So absolutely, this has been a good thing. And it does make it increasingly accessible. In Ontario, we have something called the Farmer Wellness Initiative, where farmers get free counseling. They can make a phone call and get free counseling. And so I do see some positive changes. I see the stigmas actually decreasing. We have more and more young farmers that are accessing that help, or rural people. When I say farmers, I often mean rural people. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. But I can't help but, I heard you say there, I wouldn't normally drive that 3 hours if my kid, because they don't really need it right now. And what has happened, and that's part of the barriers that rural people face, is because it used to be that if I have to drive 3 hours, I put off doing that, in the hopes that things get a little bit better, that things get better. And when they don't, by the time rural kids are accessing support, it's become, like, for instance, and when I say anxiety, it's because lots of kids experience anxiety. It's like 70% of the kids that we see, it's related to anxiety, and can be very, very severe, very significant anxiety. But when we see those early signs and indications, because there's barriers to accessing services for a lot of rural people, we don't. And by the time we do, child is 13 or 14 and unable to leave the home, and going to school is like a foo-foo dream, right? So that is consistent with what we see in our more rural areas.
So can we talk a little bit about medication for children? It's gotten more acceptable for adults to medicate, but there still seems to be a real, you're drugging your kids so you don't have to deal with them, or it's going to mess their brain up permanently, or whatever. And as an adult who's medicated, it seems ridiculous to me that, we wouldn't tell a diabetic child that we're not going to give them insulin because they need to learn how to do it themselves. I mean, we wouldn't do that. And it's bizarre to me that we wouldn't, to me personally, that we wouldn't medicate kids who need it. But I'm wondering how we can approach that with folks who are more hesitant, or family members, or
Yeah.
whoever else.
I love how you worded that, because, and I want to be cautious. I'm not a pharmacist, I'm not a doctor, so I can't speak specifically to medications and what works, what doesn't work, all of that stuff, right? It is certainly, I hope, born out of a relationship with a professional that understands those mechanisms. And you will find across the gamut, there'll be some psychiatrists who are like, I will not medicate a child under 12 years of age. And you will find psychiatrists, and you will find some psychiatrists who look at, a certain situation and says, this 5-year-old needs medication. Otherwise, we're facing a family breakdown where this child will have to live into some sort of a residential, because, like, they absolutely need some medication. So understanding that it's not this like, let's tie this a little box up and put a bow on it. There's such unique circumstances. You need a team to be involved to really understand all those pieces. And one of the things I encourage is understanding that medication alone can be effective. It can be, but rarely is it as, in fact, if ever, is it as effective as counseling and medication. And folks, I've yet to hear and I work with a lot of psychiatrists, a lot of psychologists, a lot of, doctorates in sociology who are doing, whatever. And I've yet to hear one who would say, I don't recommend counseling and medication, because really the two need to go hand in hand. When we talk about anxiety and people are really reluctant to take anxiety medication, we have to understand that for some anxiety medication, it takes up to 6 to 8 weeks to really see the full effect of how it could change things.
I wonder if sometimes parents or guardians have concerns about medicating kids in terms of, I mean, you talked about, it takes time for the medication to work, because typically, we give our kids, say an antibiotic for a week, and then hopefully they're better, right? Where we're making it feels like a bigger commitment to decide that, yes, this is something that we're going to try. But I think we also have to remember that it doesn't necessarily have to be forever, because some of these medications may work for a few months or a few years, and then maybe they get older and you decide to wean them off and see what life is like for them. And as kids get older, then they can start to make those decisions themselves, and in partnership with their doctor or therapist or the other people in their lives, then we start to give them some ownership over that. But as parents, I think there are times where like you said, with the right team in place, can make those decisions with and for your kids to give them that helping hand for now. And then, even if it's something that they look back on, in their adulthood, they can be like, oh, that worked for me then, and I'm going through a hard time now, and maybe this is something I'd try. And I know that it's not scary, and I can talk to people about it, and it's going to be okay.
I understand a parent's reluctance, right? Like I do, because we don't always know exactly how these mechanisms work. Does it play a role later on in brain development? That sort of thing. We don't necessarily have all those answers, but what we do know is helping a child thrive in their childhood makes for a more successful adult. That is just the reality. And so if it means that your child can thrive with the assistance of some medication and learn coping skills and learn other ways and become more confident, that's a good thing. And so when we have parents who are just like, oh no, I don't want to do medication, I'm always kind of like, okay, well, wait a minute. What is presenting? What's really the story here going on? Because is medication part of that journey? And sometimes I have parents who say, well, you know what, I'll do it if I have to, but I want to try therapy first. That's okay. Like that's okay too. So long as we understand that part of the story might be using medication, and in consultation with your community, your doctor, and all those support networks, that's not, we don't shun that simply because, certainly just as Katie said, like if you had a broken leg, would we not give you some Tylenol and some painkiller, or maybe some morphine? Like I don't know what it's going to look like for you. I know if I break my leg, I want morphine. I don't want a Tylenol.
Right? Good stuff.
And so it depends on what the needs are. It depends on that child. It depends on what the whole family brings to the table. If you have a family who's gone through crisis and you've got a child with some really significant needs, maybe they've gone through their own trauma or attachment, like our stories are complicated. There's no like, well, here's the rule number one. If you meet this threshold, then therefore this. No. We have complicated stories. So let's not just be opposed to medication. Let's be willing to learn about it. Let's be willing to, to talk about it. Let's consult with other people. Let's understand why they work and what they're for and all of those pieces of the puzzle.
I think one of the most telling parts for me as well was, dealing with postpartum depression and anxiety while pregnant with my second child, that it just sort of started with the first one and then continued, and being very resistant to medicating while pregnant, because what if it melts my kid's brain, or, God knows, whatever, and my doctor said it's a lot worse for your baby to deal with the mother who's that stressed out than it is for them to be
Absolutely.
exposed to medication. And it sounds horrible, but if your kid kills themselves, it's not going to matter if the medication might have changed their brain development a little, or if they end up with some, horrible addiction or whatever. There are much worse things than what might theoretically happen as a side effect of medication. And I mean, no, if my kids need medication, I won't be excited to do it. That's not the point, but there's a lot worse things. So,
I'm kind of fascinated by research, because what we know is that if a mother is going through a lot of stress, chronic stress, that impacts her hormonal development, and it impacts the child. It impacts. So to think that, well, so long as I don't take medication, my baby will be healthier than if I'm living in this chronic period of stress and anxiety and all. No, like what you're going through can impact. Now, that's not, I want to be clear though, that's not a fault thing for mothers. I think our society needs to do a way better job supporting women, period. Can I just kind of go out on a limb there?
Yep.
I hear all sorts of people, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Have you come alongside those moms who are juggling career, and who are juggling young children, and who are juggling debt, and who are juggling farm realities, and spouses that are suffering from their own stress? One of the things that we know is that farmer spouses are very rarely accessing support services for their own mental health, unless if their spouse does. And farmer wives are 8 times more likely to think about suicide than men. Now, men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide, but women are much more likely to think about it. And one of the reasons for that is because they are their spouse's sole support. Sole support, right? That isolation piece comes into play. All of those pieces come into play. And so you've got women who are juggling all of these responsibilities and their spouse's well-being, mental well-being. Now, that probably goes across the board and flips through roles and that sort of thing. I understand that, but for the general context of the conversation, it means that we have got to learn to come alongside our rural members.
And
Well,
I
I
think when
think
we talk
that's
about children's mental health specifically, there is that line of wanting to ask for help and wanting to talk about it, but also wanting to respect your kid's privacy. And that becomes tricky, right? Where you want to be able to talk to someone and look for resources and feel like you can connect with other people, but admitting to someone else that your kid is struggling and saying that out loud and knowing that you're, I'm putting quote marks on this, telling on your kid, or
Mhm.
or sharing something of theirs that you're not sure if they're comfortable with other people knowing. So then that becomes a different line, right? It's one thing to talk about your own struggles, but then to admit to others or to talk to others about your kids, it's easier to say, oh, they did great, like they won the show at the fair, or they, like they got a 100% on their test. But to tell somebody else that your kid is really having a hard time, that's a different conversation, and that becomes trickier territory.
It does, because particularly sometimes when we confide in someone else at that moment in time, it's really big for us, right? So, oh my goodness, my daughter's really going through a hard time, and I share with somebody. Well, then about 3 or 4 days later, that issue is no longer a problem for myself or for my daughter, but the person who I've confided in is still like, oh, so one of the aspects we can be, I'm not sure if you ever heard of the term being your brother's keeper or your sister's keeper. It means we choose to think the best and we believe the best. And when somebody confides in us, it's a treasure. And I count it a huge privilege. As a therapist, people confide some really painful things with me. And I choose to think to myself, wow, that is such a privilege that you would choose to share some of your deepest, hardest things with me. And because it's a privilege, I'm going to hold it with some fragile hands. I'm going to keep it protected, and I'm going to hold it with that. It's fragile. It's very precious. And if we can be that for one another, that changes some of that dichotomy of, can I trust you? Unfortunately, we in our world, sometimes we don't realize what that privilege is for someone to confide in us. But if we can live that out, it becomes a lot easier to share those things with. The other piece is recognizing that's how we decrease some stigma around it. If I can share with you, Arlene, that my daughter's struggling, and you can share, well, my kid's also struggling, or whatever, whoever that is, that's how we decrease stigma. So we hold that story to be precious, and we recognize we're not alone in this. And as parents, I don't think, aside from losing a child, I don't think there's anything more difficult for us than seeing our children suffer and feeling helpless to change it. My brother and sister-in-law, their son died when he was 4.5 years old. He died of invasive group A strep pneumonia, which is basically the flesh-eating disease that landed in your lungs. And I can't tell you how painful it was to have to watch them go through that journey. We go through our own journey, but to watch somebody go through that journey is, wow, a really hard and difficult and painful experience. But that journey, those hard pieces of our journey, are stories that are more common than what we think they are. And so when we give room and we give space to try and to share those journeys with one another, that's where we build community. That's where we build that relationship piece.
Yeah. And that's why we started a podcast, right, Katie?
It is.
Well done.
Because
Well,
it's easy for it to look easy to other people, and it's easy to think, well, it's okay to blame it on genetics for this person, but my excellent parenting should have overcome that, or, it's okay for this person to use that excuse or this or the other, but it's hard to give ourselves the same grace that we give other people. And I think it's really important, it still shocks me when people say, well, you're just such a calm mom to me, it's not my personality. It really does freak me out when people say that. And they're giving me credit for this. Like, it's medication and therapy. I mean, it has been a lot of hard work on my part, but it is largely medication and therapy. Like, it's not that I'm magically just super zen. Anyone who knows me would never believe that. But to just be very open about the things we're struggling with, because it helps other people to do it themselves and face that.
You've obviously done the work too, though.
Yeah.
Because those
No,
things
and
alone
it's been a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
But it's been assisted by a lot of other things and a lot of other people. And it is not that I am somehow just a better Zenner person than the rest of you. Yeah. Thanks to the therapy and the medication.
So we're going to go on to a lighter note now, Loren. This is usually our closing question before we get into our cussing and discussing segment. I'm stealing it from Katie. So we asked all of our guests, if you were going to dominate a category at the county fair, what would it be? And categories can be real, or that you can make them up to ensure that you dominate.
Well, in our area, we have what's called the Brigden Fair. And it has a long story in my family, because my uncle was the vet in the local area, and my grandfather was, I forget what the name is, but basically the chairman of the fair board or something to that effect, the grand marshal, I think it was called. Anyway, so I love the Brigden Fair, and it happens on Thanksgiving weekend, which is coming up. So if you're in anywhere close to Brigden, you should come to the fair.
It's October, Katie, not November.
Oh yes, sorry, my bad.
Yeah,
Canada.
Canadian Thanksgiving.
The other Thanksgiving.
Yes, yeah, our Thanksgiving.
So I do make a pretty mean salsa. It's called Wonderful Salsa if you want to look it up online. But it's really good. But
it is wonderful.
As I think about that, it would have to be the loudest, most off-key singer category in the county, because I would win that title hands down. In fact, when I was
off key.
Yeah, loud and off key. I remember in grade 1, we were singing at the music festival, and my teacher, who I adored, she was such a good grade 1 teacher. Honestly, she was a safe place for me. And we were singing at the county fair. So she came up to me, she said, "Now remember, Loren, today's the day that you sing quietly." And I was like, "Ooh, she's like coaching me personally. She really likes my singing."
Yeah, I've been putting in a lot of practice.
She was telling me to shut up because I couldn't sing on key. That's what was
She didn't tell
really
you to mouth the words, so I mean, at least she didn't totally silence you.
really quietly. In fact, when I was like 15, I have to be honest, I was one of those gals who like I just wanted to get married and have children. I was really like, oh, And I do love being married. I've been married for 25 years, and I do love being a mom. But I also love that, I'm a PhD student. I have this private practice. I have all these other things. I love that I can grow myself in many different ways, which is awesome as a woman that we have that opportunity. But on my list of the like things that I needed to see in a really good husband, really close to the top was some musical ability. And he's a music teacher, because I was really afraid for our children if there was no musical genetic passing on the torch. It was not going to come from me at all. But thankfully he took over that role. So like my kids play guitar and drums and they sing and they play cello, and I'm kind of like, that worked, right? Like that worked. That box that I ticked on my list, it worked.
20-year-old you got that figured out. So now we'll go ahead and move into our cussing and discussing segment. We've registered for an online platform called SpeakPipe, where you can leave your cussing and discussing entries for us and we can play them on the show. So go to speakpipe.com/barnyardlanguage and leave us a voice memo, or you can always send us an email at barnyardlanguage@gmail.com and we can read it out for you. So Katie, what are you cussing and discussing this week?
Okay, so this is kind of a two-parter because one, there's a lot of pressure on women to just tell people off when they offend us, which I am generally 100% behind. But for many of us who live in places where we're dealing with folks we're going to have to see again, who may have long-term relationships with us or our spouse or whoever, there's don't always just want to go ahead and tell them what you think, because you'll offend them, especially if they're older folks. They might not be on the same page about not talking about personal things about other people. So the bigger part of this is talking about other people's bodies. Don't do it. Just don't. I have decided to teach my children that if it's likely to be something that the other person already knows, you don't talk about it. So if they have lettuce in their teeth, or they've tucked their skirt into their underwear coming out of the bathroom, whatever, then tell them, because that is something they probably don't know. But if you want to talk about a disability, their weight loss, whether they're pregnant, how pregnant they are they going to get pregnant, whatever else, shut your mouth. They already know about it. You don't need to discuss it with them. Just don't do it. Just don't. It is not your business. They already know about it.
Yay, so well said.
So I feel like that's an intelligence moment that has just blessed our presence, because all too often when we're interacting with other women, remember how I just talked about coming alongside with the community? And yet we divide ourselves so quickly, and things that I might struggle with would be evident to other people, and what they struggle with isn't evident. And yet we don't go digging and pointing those things out. Like, let's just cherish one another. Let's recognize the value that we all bring to the table. Oh, that was brilliant. I love that, Katie.
I think too, you can justify, you look great today. I love your outfit, under things people might not know, because maybe they don't know that they look great, or they look happy, or they look healthy, or they're on fire, whatever.
Yeah.
But anything that they already know, you don't need to mention.
Easy. And choose to look for those things, right? Yeah. Like let's choose to look for those things that we can point out that brings value and that validates people.
Yeah, it is super awkward to have people mentioning your body shape or size or whatever else. I give it 2 thumbs down.
I have heard that before. A woman came up to another woman. She's like, "Oh, you're a pear shape."
The fuck?
Right?
Did she have a stem on the top of her head, like an actual pear? Because that's the only way you're allowed to say that.
I was flabbergasted. I could not believe the conversation. And of course, the person who heard that was like, excuse me? Like, what are we talking? Pears? Like, I don't. That was really, really. Now, thankfully, the
And
person kind of tried to back up what they were saying because they suddenly realized that they had just ultimately goofed major, but the damage was done and the hurt was there.
Hmm.
And the ignorance, I just was rather shocked by it that we would be so ignorant as to try and put certain people in certain categories based on how they look. Really? Is that what we do?
I will say that if a small child says something like this, like the having two babies in short succession did not do my stomach any good. And so I do still look several months pregnant because I have a number of hernias and a diastasis, and it's a hot mess, whatever. So this little boy walks up to me in the co-op a couple months ago and goes, "Oh, look, mommy, this lady's going to have a baby too." And his mother looks like she's just going to melt into the floor. And I'm like, he's little. He was like 4. He had a new baby sister. He was so excited.
Yeah, he's just trying to make sense of the
Fine.
world.
He's just a little duder. But if you're more than 4 feet tall, maybe 4.5 feet, because my kids are tall, just shut it. Just,
Yeah.
I will not be horrified by your kid who is just really excited about more babies in the world. But I've had adults say the same thing to me, and those people just need to shut it. Because
So
anyway,
my sister-in-law, who's a flight attendant, so she has lots of world experience, right? And she was like, if I could give the world any advice, even if the woman is on the way into the hospital to have the baby, never ask them how far along they are. Just drop that from your entire,
Yeah. Unless
because
you are
we
the
don't
doctor
know.
or nurse in the office and it's your job to
Yeah,
ask
and
that question.
we don't know. We don't know.
Yeah.
And recently I've worked with a couple of couples who have, unfortunately, their children have been born sleeping, like they have had stillborn babies. And I remember when I had a miscarriage, really late miscarriage. It was like an 18, our baby was 18 weeks. I was 18 weeks along when we had, so it was quite a late miscarriage, And I remember having this one person come up to me and say, "Oh my goodness, you look so fabulous." And then I said, "Well, actually, we've miscarried the baby." And of course, they wanted to melt in a puddle. That was okay. That was, that's innocent. We had shared that we were pregnant. We hadn't really shared that we had lost the child yet. And so we were, that was okay. But other than those innocent circumstances, just try to leave out that whole term. How far along are you? Just drop it.
Yeah.
also,
Yeah.
I'm going to add, well, as long as it's healthy to that, because, oh, well, your baby is lacking. It's already ruined. Maybe next time you'll get luckier and have a better one. Ugh, anyway.
And that one comes across as, it's coming from a good place. You get what people are trying to say, but as long as it's healthy, then both seems like it's tempting fate and telling you that if this child is not healthy, that they're less than, right? That one's rough.
Anyway, Loren, what do you have to cuss and discuss?
Yours was good. Yours was really good.
I've had a couple weeks to work on it though. So
yeah, I've got a couple. One of them is how often I hear people say, "Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about." And then they start talking about their own experience. And I'm like, why can't we need to live in a world where we're just willing to listen and validate other people's experiences and just give value to it. But then last night I had a terrible sleep and I thought, I'm just going to say that there is not enough good quality pillows out there because honestly, like, why can we not have a good night's sleep? I've tried the foam ones. I've got lots of feather ones and I know there's a really good one in the basement, but by the time I get like ready to crawl into bed, I don't want to go all the way down the basement to grab one. So that was my other kind of piece. But originally it was on, like, we really can't do this life thing alone. So let's validate people's experience and come into a form of agreement with them and champion them and walk alongside rather than so often I have people say, "Oh, I know exactly what they're going through." And I'm like, yeah, no, you don't actually. We don't walk that same road. Oh, if they could walk a mile in my shoes. No, it's your own journey. And I want to come alongside your journey, but it's still your journey. Nobody else can walk that but you.
Mm-hmm. And you can be empathetic and supportive without completely understanding. That's okay too.
Yeah.
You don't have to completely get it.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to become about you, right? I think
Yeah.
so often people, we want to be empathetic so much that we start talking about our own experience. And I'm just like, let's not do that. I mean, there is a time to share our story. Something like this podcast where you've shared your story is impactful. It's fantastic. But sometimes uh, what I typically see more often is people are so dismissive, right? So somebody shares something really hard with you, and we're uncomfortable with that hard thing. So we just dismiss it. We kind of try and type a bow on it and pack it away, or we try and sweep it under a rug because we're just so uncomfortable with that. And let's be willing to be uncomfortable with people because they're going through hard things. And so we can sit in that place of being uncomfortable with one another. It's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Narlene, what do you have today?
Well, I'm just going back to this damn fly that won't stop it's landing on my face, my microphone, on the camera, and it's just a symptom of all the other flies that are in my house because, farmhouses. And then it's also that, that special time of year when it's not just flies, but then they bite. But at least a mosquito will land long enough and you can kill it. But like flies somehow like bite and keep moving. I don't know how they do it, but they can hurt you before you even have a chance to swat them. So I'm just gonna say, barnhouse flies, they suck.
I here. I wholeheartedly.
It's not deep, but I mean it's relevant.
Arlene, let me show you the most
Oh,
American thing in the world. There, I guess.
okay, what are you showing us? It's an
it is
audio
called-
medium.
Yes, it looks kind of like a super soaker, like a water gun. It is called the Bug Assault Rifle, and it is
Okay.
indeed a gun for killing flies.
So
It
it
is
shoots
filled
like
with
granules
table
of salt.
salt.
Oh,
It does. If you hit a horse fly to close enough distance, they do actually just vaporize.
wow.
It's easily the most American thing I've ever encountered, and I love it so much.
Wow. I may have to
I
invest
believe their
in that.
website is bugassault.com. The best part is that it comes
They're
with
going to become a sponsor
sights.
next week.
Maybe. They actually sell laser sights for them and
Oh my gosh, for
a
flies.
specialized gun rack. So I got my father-in-law one for his birthday, and he is also very excited.
I'm buying one. I just wrote down the website when we get
It's
off.
seriously the most satisfying thing in the world.
Yeah. That'll be the only gun in my house.
Yeah, but it would be the most satisfying.
It
Yes.
really is.
As foster parents, we can't have guns in the house. Well, we don't have any guns in the house. As foster parents, there's some really stringent rules, which makes sense, right? But
Yeah.
I think I could have that one. I think that would
Yeah, you could justify that one.
The ammo's a lot cheaper too.
Yeah,
So,
usually I've got a box of salt anyway. So
yeah, see. Yep, there you go. I'll go ahead and get that sponsorship deal written up for him.
Yeah, that's right. So we talked a lot about a lot of heavy stuff today, but we also got some good life advice for houseflies. So, Loren, if someone wants to connect with you or find you online, find more out about your practice or the Alliance, where can they find you?
The easiest way is probably through our website, which is www.nfmha, so National Farmers Mental Health Alliance acronym.ca. It's probably the easiest way to get in touch with us. And we have therapists who are able, we have some actually that are coming on board in the US as well, which we're really excited about. So if that's you, then reach out to us for sure. We're also, looking for more lived ag experience therapists. So if you're a social worker out there, or if you're a therapist in the States, if you're an LPC, and you're also a farmer and you're interested in kind of working with us, then we invite you to reach out, because we can't do it alone. And we want to be able to provide support wherever farmers are, which is all across our countries, our great nations. And so we want to partner with more.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Loren. It was a good one.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today on Barnyard Language. If you enjoy the show, we encourage you to support us by becoming a patron. Go to www.patreon.com/barnyardlanguage to make a small monthly donation to help cover the costs of making the show.
Please rate and review the podcast and follow the show so you never miss an episode.
You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok as Barnyard Language, and on Twitter, we are Barnyard Pod. If you'd like to connect with other farming families, you can join our private Barnyard Language Facebook group.
We're always in search of future guests for the podcast. If you or someone you know would like to chat with us, get in touch. We are a proud member of the Positively Farming Media Podcast Network.